My daughter forgot to hang up the phone. I wasn't supposed to hear what came next, but I did, and I've never been the same since. "It's time," she said, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "He's too much to manage. We need to move him into a care facility." Her husband didn't even hesitate. "The house is worth nearly 900 grand. We sell, we buy the place in Aspen, and we don't have to worry about him anymore." In that moment, something inside me didn't just crack, it shattered. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. Your support helps us share stories that matter, stories that remind us that even the quietest people have something to say, sometimes louder than anyone expects. I didn't say a word. Not when the call ended, not when I sat there frozen in Margaret's old recliner, the same place she used to read her mystery novels every night before the cancer came. Instead, I just stared out the bay window, the one I built for her when we couldn't afford a contractor and all we had was a dream and a second-hand toolbox. The backyard looked the same, peaceful even, but everything had changed. They called me a burden, a problem to solve. My own daughter, Samantha, whom I had once rocked to sleep, whose algebra homework I'd helped with at the kitchen table, was planning to sell my life out from under me. Not for my health, not out of concern, but because I was inconvenient. I'd been widowed for almost 2 years. Margaret's photo still sat on the mantel, next to the clock she gave me on our 15th anniversary. I talked to her more now than I ever did when she was alive. That night I looked into her eyes, still so full of kindness, even frozen in that silver frame, and I knew I wasn't going to let this happen. I wasn't going to let our sacrifices, our history, be turned into someone else's down payment. My name is Paul Monroe. I'm 72 years old. And this is the story of how I sold everything to take back my life. Samantha and Daniel were away on a week-long business trip in Phoenix. They left smiling, thinking everything was under control. What they didn't know was that the moment I heard those words, that betrayal, they set something unstoppable in motion. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just got to work. I'm a builder by trade, retired now, but old habits die hard. I started with paperwork. Our mortgage documents, the deed mine alone now, after Margaret passed. Insurance records, receipts from Samantha's college tuition, the $50,000 I worked 2 jobs to cover, the wedding I paid for when she begged for something dreamlike, even though we could barely afford our own groceries that year, the car loan I co-signed when her credit couldn't carry it, the resume I rewrote for Daniel after he got fired and temporarily moved into my house rent-free. All of it, laid bare. Years of silent giving, self-sacrifice, of playing the role of the strong, dependable father. I remembered every promise I made to Margaret, especially the one I broke. "Don't let them take advantage of you, Paul. Promise me you'll protect yourself." I hadn't, until now. That night, I poured myself a small glass of whiskey, clicked on the desk lamp in my home office, and pulled out a business card Margaret had tucked away after her diagnosis. Caleb Ross, estate attorney. We'd met with him when we were getting our affairs in order, just in case. I never thought I'd need him again, but that's the thing about betrayal. It shows up when you least expect it, and it doesn't knock politely. The next morning, I met Caleb in his office, modest, quiet, the kind of place you go when you're serious, not flashy. I laid out everything. What I overheard, their plans, the house, the timing. He listened without judgment. "You're not alone," he said quietly. "This happens more than people realize. But you're in full control, Paul. The house is yours. They have no legal claim to it. That was all I needed, that and a good realtor." I did my research like I was still on the job, checked references, success rates, average closing times. One name stood out, Lucas Avery. Fast, professional, discreet. We met the next day. He walked through my house with a quiet reverence I didn't expect from someone his age. "You built this?" he asked, running his hand over the crown molding I carved by hand. "Every nail," I replied. We priced it at $890,000. Within 72 hours, we had a cash offer from a firm specializing in high-end rentals. No financing delays, no repair haggling, closing in 10 days. I signed the papers, and for the first time in years I slept through the night. While Samantha and Daniel enjoyed 5-star meals and spa treatments, I was packing up a life. Not just mine, but the remnants of a woman I loved, a daughter I raised, and a home I built from nothing but sweat, sacrifice, and hope. I moved into a quiet senior apartment in Highlands Ranch. Clean, modest, comfortable. More importantly, it was mine. Then I changed the locks, installed a hidden surveillance camera in the entryway, left a letter taped to the front door, addressed in my neatest handwriting, Samantha and Daniel. Inside, I told them everything. I heard your call. I know your plan. The house is sold. The money is safe. Your things are in storage. You have 30 days to collect them. I gave you everything, and you repaid me with cruelty. Consider this your inheritance lesson. When they returned, suitcase wheels clicking against the pavement, I watched them try the key. The camera feed was crisp. Samantha's face morphed from confusion to panic. Daniel tried the back door. Nothing. Then the window I left unlocked, just enough for them to crawl through. They found the letter. They read the words. And then, finally, they understood. The man they thought they could manage had managed to outthink them all. Their burden had become their reckoning. And me? I had become free. If you've ever felt underestimated, overlooked, discarded, know this. Silence doesn't mean weakness. Age doesn't mean surrender. And sometimes, the quietest revolutions happen behind locked doors, with nothing but a pen, a plan, and a promise kept. The moment the key didn't turn, Samantha's posture shifted, shoulders tightening, chin lifting in that automatic, dismissive way I'd seen since she was 15. Back then, it was a fight over curfew. Today, it was the dawning realization that her plan wasn't just unraveling, it had been blown apart. She jiggled the key again, hard, as if the lock had simply made a mistake. That's strange, she muttered, more to herself than to Daniel, who was now dragging both their suitcases up the walkway. Let me try the garage, but I had disabled the opener 2 days ago. I watched all of this in real time from the comfort of my armchair in the apartment I'd rented under a new P.O. box, a cup of black coffee in hand. Calm, centered, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I zoomed in slightly on the screen of my phone. The camera I'd installed, a simple little charger plugged into the outlet beside the coat rack, captured everything in full HD. Every twitch of confusion on Samantha's face, every furrow in Daniel's brow as he returned from the garage door, unsuccessful. She must have changed the locks, Samantha said with an edge in her voice, still not quite ready to entertain the possibility that I had done this. She? Daniel echoed. You mean he? That's when they both went quiet. A long, loaded silence. No, Samantha said finally. No way. He wouldn't even know how to call a locksmith, let alone hire one. I smiled. They always underestimated me. Mistook kindness for weakness. Mistook a quiet demeanor for mental decline. Mistook love for permission. Try calling him, Daniel said. Landline first. Samantha fished out her phone and dialed. I watched her frown deepen as the call rang and rang and rang. No voicemail, just the empty silence of a number that had been disconnected 2 days prior. She tried my old cell number next, but she'd forgotten I never carried one. Said I didn't need one. And truthfully, for years, I didn't. Now, of course, I had a prepaid device locked away in the drawer of my kitchen, along with the new lease agreement and receipts from the moving company. He's gone, Samantha said finally, voice tight. He's not here. Well, where the hell is he? Daniel snapped, his patience eroding as quickly as his control. He didn't tell you anything before we left? No, she hissed. He was his usual self. Thanked me for calling, told me he loved me, said he was proud. Just normal. She swallowed. Too normal. That's when they noticed the envelope taped to the inside of the door. White, crisp, marked in my handwriting. Samantha and Daniel. Samantha stared at it as though it might detonate. Open it, Daniel said. It's obviously from him. I watched her tear it open. Her hands were trembling now. As she read, her expression cracked. The words hit her in waves. I know what you said. I know what you planned. The house is sold. The money is mine. I'm not your burden. I'm your reckoning. She crumpled to the floor. Not a dramatic collapse, but slow, like the weight of her own shame was pulling her down. Daniel read over her shoulder, and for the first time since I'd known him, he had nothing smug to say, just silence, and then a curse under his breath. He played us. I almost laughed. No, Daniel, I outplayed you. What the hell are we supposed to do now? Samantha whispered. Her mascara was streaked, her mouth trembling. The lease is up in 4 days. We were counting on that money. He knew we were counting on that money. You mean you were, Daniel snapped. You told me it would be simple. That your dad trusted you. That he'd sign whatever we put in front of him. And you told me he was too old to notice, she shot back. You said people like him lose track of paperwork. That we could handle it gently. You didn't want gentle, Daniel growled. You wanted convenient. For a long time they didn't say anything. Just stood there, in the entryway of a house that no longer belonged to them, surrounded by furniture that had seen more love in a single year than either of them had shown me in a decade. Finally, Samantha sat on the edge of the coffee table, the same one I built the year she turned 8, the same one she once spilled grape juice on and cried, thinking I'd be angry. I wasn't. I told her love was more important than polish. She'd forgotten that. She forgot a lot. Maybe we can contest the sale, she murmured. There has to be some legal recourse. Daniel shook his head. Contest what? It was his house. It was his name on the deed. He didn't owe us anything, and you know it. I'm his daughter, she cried. And he gave you more than most fathers ever would. Daniel snapped. He paid for school, your wedding, our groceries, and we were going to dump him like a sack of laundry. She looked at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. And what about you, Daniel? You pushed for this just as hard. You said we deserved better. You said we needed to act before he forgot who we were. He didn't flinch. Well, guess what? He remembered exactly who we were. That's the problem. In my apartment, I turned off the feed. I'd seen enough. Not out of anger, no, that had long since cooled, but out of a sense of completion. The message had landed. Not through yelling or confrontation, but through clarity. They were living the consequences of their own choices, of their own greed. I poured myself a glass of Margaret's favorite wine, the bottle we'd saved for a special anniversary that never came, and sat beside the window, the one that looked out over the small courtyard where children played and old men watered plants. Peaceful, unassuming. My new life. Not grand, not glamorous, but mine. Outside, the wind rustled the trees with the same hush that once moved through our old backyard in spring. I looked at the picture of Margaret on the table and whispered, I kept my promise. I had. She asked me not to let them use me, not to be too kind for my own good. I had been kind, too kind, but no more. Samantha and Daniel could start again if they wanted. They were young, healthy, capable. I hadn't destroyed them. I'd simply removed the easy path. The inheritance wasn't gone, it had just changed hands. And I, finally, had my hands back on the wheel. The next morning I went to the little cafe 2 blocks down. Sarah, the barista, smiled as I walked in. The usual, Mr. Monroe? I nodded. She remembered. People can remember, when they care enough to try. As I sipped my coffee, I watched a mother tie her toddler's shoes. A retiree fed pigeons near a bench. The world moved on, just as it should. But this time, I wasn't being left behind. I had made sure of that. I wasn't anyone's burden. I was my own man. Again. Still. Always. For the next 3 days, I didn't hear from Samantha or Daniel. Not a single call, not a text, not a desperate knock at the door. Nothing. I imagine they needed time to let it sink in, not just the logistics of what had happened, but the full emotional weight of it. That the person they assumed would always be there, compliant and passive, had simply vanished. Not with bitterness, not in a rage, but on his own terms, with grace and intention. That must have been the hardest part to accept. But for me, those days felt like oxygen after too long underwater. I hadn't realized how small I'd been living, how much I'd shrunk myself to fit into the role they needed me to play. The quiet old man, the placeholder, the bank account with gray hair. At Sunset Ridge Apartments, my world was smaller, yes, but it was entirely mine. The studio wasn't much, just 4 walls, a clean kitchenette, and a view of the street below. But there was peace in it, the kind of peace that comes from knowing no one can open your front door without your consent. I spent the first morning rearranging what little I'd brought with me. Margaret's jewelry box went on the dresser just as it had in our old bedroom for over 40 years. Her reading glasses rested beside it, folded carefully, still marked by the faintest smudge on the right lens she never seemed to clean completely. I unpacked the wedding photo last, placing it on the nightstand beside the bed. We were young in that picture, and the way she looked at me, chin slightly tilted, eyes glowing with a private joke, still knocked the breath out of me. Then I opened my laptop and logged into my new online bank account. The number blinked back at me. 880, $7,340, after taxes, fees, and a few upfront payments. That's what remained. More money than I'd ever seen in one place, more than I thought I'd ever touch. And now, it was under no one's control but mine. I didn't feel greedy. I didn't even feel triumphant. What I felt was anchored. Like for the first time in years, my life belonged solely to me. On the second day, I walked to the nearby park. It wasn't anything grand, just a few benches, some tall cottonwoods, a path that looped around a duck pond. I brought a small thermos of coffee and sat under the shade, watching life unfold at its slow, gentle pace. There was an older man feeding breadcrumbs to the ducks with surgical precision, as if he knew each one by name. A young couple walked past holding hands, the girl's head resting lightly on the man's shoulder. I remembered what it felt like to walk beside Margaret that way. We used to do that every Sunday morning, no matter how tight money was or how tired I felt from the work week. She used to say, "A walk is free, but if you're really present, it's priceless." She was always good at noticing the things that didn't cost anything. I stayed until the sun started casting long shadows across the water, and then I made my way back to the apartment. As I reached the front steps, a woman was exiting the building carrying 2 bags of groceries. She looked to be in her mid-60s, silver hair in a neat braid, face lined not with age but with laughter. "You must be new," she said, pausing at the door. "I don't recognize you." "Paul," I said, offering a small smile. "Just moved in last week." "Karen," she replied. "Unit 302. If you ever need anything, milk, sugar, a screwdriver, I'm that neighbor." I thanked her. She nodded once, then disappeared down the sidewalk, humming to herself. It wasn't much. Just a small moment of human warmth. But in a life recently scorched by betrayal, it felt like sunlight through a crack in the wall. That night, I slept deeply. No creaks of an old house settling, no phantom footsteps down the hallway I used to imagine were Margaret's, just stillness. When I woke the next morning, I made eggs and toast and poured a second cup of coffee. I read the paper from front to back. I even looked at the crossword, though Margaret had always been the puzzle solver between us. Around 10 a.m., my prepaid phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize lit up the screen. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, another call. Same number. This time I answered. "Mr. Monroe?" the voice asked. "Male, tight, corporate. This is Jason Carter. I represent Samantha and Daniel Moore." I said nothing, just waited. "They've asked me to reach out regarding the recent sale of your home at 48 North Maple Drive, Ive. They're requesting a discussion about the disbursement of assets." I exhaled slowly. "There is no discussion. The sale was legal. The funds are mine. They're not entitled to a cent." "I understand your position," he replied quickly, his tone dipping into caution. "However, they believe there may have been undue influence or possible mental decline which—" I cut him off. "Jason," I said, voice even, "I'm 72, not senile, and the only undue influence I experienced was the pressure to disappear quietly so they could liquidate my life. That won't happen. Tell them to stop calling." Then I hung up. I set the phone down beside Margaret's photo and stared at it for a long time. I wasn't angry, just exhausted. Betrayal drains you in a way that no labor ever can. You can dig 100 holes and still get up the next day. But when someone you love tries to hollow you out from the inside, it takes everything just to stay upright. That afternoon, I drove to the storage facility where I'd moved Samantha and Daniel's belongings. The man at the front desk greeted me with a cheerful, "Hello again, Mr. Monroe." I handed him the updated payment slip, 3 months prepaid. "They have 30 days, I reminded him. "After that, it's up to you." He nodded. "We'll call if they show up." I thanked him, turned, and walked out. By the end of the week, I began crafting a letter not to Samantha or Daniel, but to myself. a kind of inventory, not of possessions, but of identity, who I had been, who I had become, who I still wanted to be. I wrote it in longhand, in the same cursive Margaret always said looked like a blueprint. I wrote about the years I'd spent building homes with calloused hands and aching knees. I wrote about love and loss, and the subtle art of letting go without bitterness. I wrote about the joy of small routines, morning coffee, evening walks, the smell of fresh bread, and about the pain of watching your legacy reduced to a spreadsheet in someone else's plan. Most importantly, I wrote about freedom, not the kind they wave flags for, but the quiet, internal kind. The kind you earn not through battles, but through decisions, through boundaries, through finally saying enough and meaning it. When I finished, I folded the pages carefully, slid them into an envelope, and tucked it into the back of Margaret's jewelry box. It wasn't a will. It was a statement of life. A declaration that I had, against all expectations, chosen myself. On Sunday morning, I returned to the cafe. Sarah was there, same bright smile, same purple streak in her ponytail. "You're early today, Mr. Monroe." "It's a good day," I said. Felt like starting it right. She handed me my coffee. "Anything else I can get you?" I looked around. The cafe buzzed with quiet life. A child laughed in the corner. Someone strummed a guitar near the window. "No," I said, "this is enough." And for the first time in a long, long while, it truly was. The following week passed quietly, almost suspiciously so. No more calls from lawyers, no surprise knocks at my door, no signs of Samantha or Daniel storming back into my life. Just calm. And while part of me stayed alert, waiting for some last-ditch attempt to reclaim what they'd lost, another part started to believe something unexpected had happened. They might have finally understood that I was done, that I wasn't negotiating, that my silence wasn't a doorway to guilt, but a closed chapter sealed tight. I kept my routines. Mornings at the cafe, afternoons in the park, evenings spent in my small apartment with a paperback or a photo album I brought from storage. I was beginning to appreciate the quiet moments again. The soft clink of a spoon in a coffee mug, the creak of a floorboard as I walked from room to room, the sigh of the wind against the window pane. They weren't distractions, they were affirmations. I had time now. Time to think, to reflect, to remember who I was, before I became someone else's convenience. Still, every so often I'd find myself staring out the window at night, wondering how it had come to this. Wondering when the shift happened, when Samantha stopped seeing me as her father and started seeing me as an obstacle. I thought back to her childhood, to the nights I stayed up making her science fair volcanoes, the way she'd squeal with excitement when I came home from work and tossed her into the air. The sleepovers, the school dances, the way she clung to my hand on her first day of kindergarten, like I was her anchor in a sea of strangers. Where did that go? Did it fade slowly, year by year, as comfort turned into expectation? Or did it vanish all at once, the moment Margaret died, and there was no one left to remind her how much love costs to build? One morning, while organizing some of Margaret's old things, I came across a notebook I hadn't seen in years. Her handwriting curled across the pages in steady blue ink, grocery lists, to-do notes, and in the back, a series of personal journal entries. Nothing dramatic, just her quiet thoughts. A life observed from the edges. One line caught my breath. "Paul gives everything, but I don't think he remembers to keep anything for himself." I sat with that sentence for a long time. It wasn't a criticism. It wasn't even sadness. It was just truth, spoken softly, from the woman who knew me better than anyone ever would. And maybe she was right. Maybe I'd spent so long giving tuition, weddings, loans, free rent, emotional labor, that I forgot I was allowed to want things too. Like peace, like dignity, like choice. That afternoon I went to visit Margaret's grave. It was the first time I'd been since the move. I brought a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite, and sat beside her headstone as the breeze rustled through the evergreens. "You were right," I said, my voice low but steady. "I gave too much. Let them take too much, but not anymore." I took a deep breath, tracing her name in the etched granite. "I did what you asked, Maggie. I took care of myself, and I think you'd be proud." When I returned home, there was a letter waiting in my mailbox. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. Samantha's. I debated opening it. My first instinct was to toss it in the trash. But something in me hesitated, not out of hope, but out of curiosity. I opened it at the kitchen table, the late afternoon light slanting across the counter I'd wiped clean an hour earlier. Dad, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to apologize for what you heard, or how we made you feel. The truth is, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought we were helping you. I see now how wrong I was. You didn't deserve that. You've always been there for me. Even when I didn't appreciate it. Even when I took it for granted. I realize now I've spent most of my adult life assuming you'd always be there to catch us. That you'd never say no. I don't think I ever saw how hard you were holding everything together, or what it cost you. We're not asking for anything. Not anymore. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. I really, truly am. Love, Samantha. I read it twice, then a third time. And finally I folded it gently and slid it into the back of the same notebook Margaret had written in. Not because I forgave her, not yet, but because I wanted to remember this feeling, not victory, but the stillness that comes after standing your ground. The letter didn't change what had happened, but it acknowledged it, and that, in its own way, mattered. A week later, I received a call from the storage facility. Samantha had come by to collect their things. No fuss, no confrontation, just quiet boxes in the back of a rented truck. I imagined her lifting those boxes with the weight of everything unsaid inside them. I hoped she saw the lesson in that moment, that the things we assume are ours must always be earned and protected. By now, I'd started to build something new. Nothing flashy, just simple routines that made life feel full. I joined a walking group that met twice a week. I volunteered at the local library on Thursday mornings, shelving books and chatting with retirees who were rediscovering reading for pleasure. I bought a used camera and started taking photos. Trees, birds, street signs, old storefronts. Margaret had always said I had a good eye, though I'd never believed her. But now, behind the lens, I started to see the world differently. Slower, softer, more detailed. One afternoon, Karen from Unit 302 stopped by with a tin of cookies. "For the new guy," she said, smiling. "I figured you could use a little sugar." We talked for almost an hour in the hallway, just about nothing. Weather, books, the quirks of old plumbing. It felt good. Not like starting over. Just starting. And in the evenings, I still sat by the window. Sometimes with a glass of wine, sometimes with just the sound of the city in the distance. I thought about Margaret, about the home we'd built, about Samantha's tiny shoes tapping down the hallway as a child. And I thought about now this apartment, this chair, this moment. It wasn't the life I'd imagined, but it was mine. And sometimes, that's more than enough. There's a strange kind of clarity that settles in after a storm has passed. Not excitement, not relief exactly, but something quieter, like silence after thunder. The kind of silence that doesn't beg to be broken. That's what the weeks after Samantha's letter felt like. No apologies over the phone, no dramatic pleas, just quiet. And that quiet told me she understood now. Maybe not everything, but enough. And that was the first time I noticed something shift, not just in the world around me, but in me. I stopped expecting closure in the form of an apology that would undo what was done. I'd learned by then. Forgiveness doesn't always need permission. Sometimes it's simply a decision to stop carrying weight that isn't yours, to stop looking backward for answers when you're already walking forward. It was a Friday morning when I realized that. I was sitting in the cafe, my cafe now, in the same way my apartment was mine, my days were mine, my future was mine. Sarah brought over my usual and placed it on the table without a word, just a smile. I took a sip and stared out the window. Across the street, a man about my age was helping his grandson onto a park bench. The boy's legs dangled, swinging, too short to reach the ground. I watched as the man unwrapped 2 sandwiches from wax paper, 1 ham and cheese, 1 peanut butter. He handed the smaller one to the boy, who grinned up at him like it was the best thing he'd ever received. I smiled. Not wistfully, not sadly, just warmly. For a long time, I used to think that kind of closeness with family was something permanent. That once built, it stayed built. But it turns out relationships are like houses. If you stop maintaining them, if you ignore the cracks and leaks, they rot from the inside out. Still, that didn't mean you couldn't build something new, from scratch, just for you. I paid my tab, nodded goodbye to Sarah, and walked home. On the way, I passed a community bulletin board with a bright yellow flyer pinned to the center. Volunteers needed. Mentors for Young Builders program. Saturdays, 9 a.m., 12 p.m. All skill levels welcome. I paused. My first thought was to keep walking, but something pulled at me. Maybe curiosity, maybe instinct, maybe that strange feeling of a door unlocking somewhere inside your chest when you didn't even realize it had been closed. The next morning I showed up at the address on the flyer, an old middle school gym converted into a community center. It smelled like sawdust and teenage sweat and hope. A woman named Carla greeted me at the check-in table. Mid-40s, friendly, firm handshake. You must be Paul. Heard you've got some real-world construction experience. I chuckled. More years than I'd care to admit. Mostly residential. Did my own framing, finish work. Even built my own house once. She raised an eyebrow. Built it yourself? I nodded. Every nail. Well, she smiled. Then you're about to become the most popular guy in here. I spent the next 3 hours surrounded by teenagers who barely knew how to hold a hammer but were hungry to learn. Some were quiet, some were cocky. All of them watched me work like I was performing magic. I showed them how to square a corner, how to measure twice and cut once. I showed them the difference between doing something fast and doing it right. At the end of the session, one boy, Marcus, maybe 15, came up to me and said, "You make this look easy." I looked him straight in the eye and replied, "It's not, but it's worth doing well. Most things are." Driving home that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't in years. Purpose. Not obligation, not sacrifice, not guilt disguised as generosity. Just pure, quiet purpose. I wasn't anyone's burden here. I wasn't someone to be managed or maneuvered around. I was useful. I was needed. And not because someone wanted my house, or my savings, or my silence, but because I had something to give that money couldn't buy. That night, I called Caleb Ross, my lawyer. "Caleb," I said, "I need to make some changes to my will." "Of course, Paul," he said. "Want to come in next week?" "Let's make it Monday," I replied. "And this time I'd like to do more than just protect my assets. I'd like to direct them." I spent the weekend thinking about what mattered most. I didn't want revenge, not anymore. That itch had already been scratched. What I wanted was legacy, not in the traditional sense, not in marble plaques or family estates, but in people, in lives changed. So on Monday, I sat in Caleb's office and rewrote everything. I left a modest portion of my estate to Samantha, not because she deserved it, but because Margaret would have wanted me to. I attached a letter to it, in my own handwriting. This is not a reward. It is a reminder that love is not a transaction, and that forgiveness, when given freely, is the most valuable thing a person can inherit. The rest of the money? I divided it between 3 places: the local library, the community center, and the Young Builders program. I want them to have the tools I didn't, I told Caleb. Not just the physical ones, but the belief that they're capable, that they can build something lasting, even if they have to start from nothing. He looked at me for a long time before saying, "Paul, you realize most people your age are downsizing, protecting what they have. You're expanding." I smiled. That's the thing about starting over. You realize how much room you still have. The next Saturday at the workshop, Marcus showed up early. He brought a friend with him this time, a quiet kid named Leo who barely said a word. I showed them how to set up a miter saw and explained what a 45-degree bevel was. Leo didn't talk much, but he watched everything. At one point, I caught him measuring a cut 3 times before picking up the saw. I grinned. He was learning. Later, as the kids packed up, Marcus lingered behind. "Hey, Mr. Monroe," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. You think someone like me could really build houses one day?" I looked him in the eye. "You build one every day, Marcus. Every choice you make. Every piece of character you put down like a brick. Skill will come. But the foundation? That starts now." He nodded slowly. "Thanks," he said before heading out the door. And when the gym was quiet again, I stood there alone, the smell of sawdust hanging in the air, the light slanting in from high windows. I ran a hand along one of the finished workbenches we'd assembled, and for the first time in a long time, I felt not just whole but full. Because this wasn't a second chance. It was my first real one. It was a gray afternoon when she showed up. I should have expected it at some point, but after all the silence, I'd started to believe she might never come. I was rinsing my coffee mug in the sink when I saw the silhouette outside through the frosted glass of the entryway. A moment of hesitation past half a breath, no more before a firm knock sounded on the door. I stood there for another second, watching the mug drip quietly on the drying rack, then walked over and opened it. And there she was. Samantha, my daughter, standing under the weight of the Denver sky with her hands tucked into the sleeves of a too-thin coat, her eyes flicking up at mine with something between resolve and regret. "Hi, Dad," she said. Her voice was softer than I remembered, still familiar, still hers, but stripped of its usual polish. It carried no charm, no rehearsed affection, just a kind of quiet bravery. "May I come in?" I stepped aside without a word. She walked in slowly, looking around the apartment the way people do when they're trying not to look lost. Her eyes paused on the framed wedding photo of Margaret and me, then on the bookshelf where my old engineering awards sat next to a worn leather-bound Bible Margaret used to keep by the bed. "It's smaller than the house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but it's warm. It feels like you." I didn't respond. I just gestured to the small kitchen table by the window. She sat down while I poured 2 glasses of water and placed one in front of her. Silence settled between us, not tense, but brittle, like a floor you test before taking the next step. She wrapped her hands around the glass but didn't drink. "I've thought about this for a long time," she began. "What I would say if I ever saw you again. What kind of father I was asking for when I made you feel like a burden. But none of it sounds good enough now. Nothing sounds honest enough to make up for what we did." I sat down across from her and studied her face. She looked tired. Not just the kind of tired that comes from a restless night, but the kind that sits in your bones. I could see faint shadows under her eyes, lines around her mouth I hadn't noticed before. She wasn't the child I once carried through the snow on Christmas Eve, or the teenager who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat on our way home from college visits. She was something else now, older, humbled, and maybe, finally, aware. "You didn't just make me feel like a burden," I said slowly. "You made plans for my absence while I was still sitting at the dinner table. That's not something you patch up with a visit and a cup of water." She nodded once, swallowing hard. "I know. That's why I haven't called. I wasn't sure if I should ever call. But then I kept thinking about what you said in your letter. This is your lesson. And I realized I hadn't really learned anything if I just disappeared. If I didn't come back and at least say it out loud." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin envelope. No seal, no name on the front, just folded paper. She slid it across the table. "This isn't money," she said quickly, as if reading my thoughts. "It's a letter. One I wrote to Mom. I didn't know where else to put the things I couldn't say to you yet. I don't expect you to read it. I thought maybe you'd want it near her things. That maybe she'd understand before you do." I didn't touch the envelope. Not yet. It sat between us like a final exam I hadn't studied for. "What happened, Sam?" I asked. "What made you change your mind?" She looked out the window for a moment. A breeze stirred the trees in the courtyard. A couple walked by with a dog, chatting quietly. Then she turned back to me. "Daniel left. About 3 weeks after we got back and found the letter on the door. He said I'd let everything slip too far, that I'd ruined his future, that he'd only stayed with me because he thought there was stability with you. But when you cut us off, he realized I didn't have much to offer without your support." Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't cry. But the words landed with the dull ache of something long infected. "So he left. Took the car, the savings, and half the furniture. I haven't seen him since." I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch again. She wasn't telling me this to gain pity, I could tell that much. She was telling me because pain tells the truth when pride won't. "And you?" I asked. "What have you done since?" "I moved into a 1-bedroom near Capitol Hill," she said. "Took a job at a non-profit. They help reskill women coming out of abusive marriages or long-term dependency. I teach digital marketing and grant writing. I raised an eyebrow. You always hated teaching. I did, she said with a sad smile. But now I see why you did it all those years. Why you sacrificed. It's not about what you give. It's about who you give it to. And when you realize you've been pouring into a glass with no bottom, it breaks you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Finally, I reached across the table and tapped the envelope gently. If you're hoping for some grand reconciliation, I said, I'm not there yet. I might never be. You hurt me, Sam. Not just once. Not just with what you said on that call, but with years of silence. Years of expecting, assuming, taking. She nodded. I know, but, I continued, I also know Margaret would have reminded me that people can change. That grace isn't something you wait to feel, it's something you choose. She looked down at her hands. I'm not asking to move back into your life, Dad. I just wanted to show up, to take responsibility. And if that's all I'm allowed, then that's enough. I stood and walked over to the bookshelf, took down Margaret's notebook and opened it to the back. I slid Samantha's envelope inside, then closed the cover and placed it back where it belonged. She'd want that there, I said. Samantha stood too. She didn't try to hug me, didn't try to cry. She just looked at me and said, Thank you for letting me in, even just for today. Then she turned and walked to the door. Just before leaving, she paused and glanced back. You were right, she added. About everything. About giving too much. About forgetting gratitude. About what love really means. I hope someday I can show you that I learned something from this. The door closed softly behind her. I stood for a long moment, staring at the space she'd just occupied. It felt like Margaret had been in the room somehow, like the light had shifted. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something that looked a little like its shadow. That night, I went for a walk. The air was cool, crisp. Autumn had begun to sneak in around the edges of summer. I passed by a house on the corner, windows lit up with a family laughing inside, a boy chasing a dog, a woman folding laundry in the background. I didn't envy them. I didn't mourn what I'd lost. I simply kept walking, one foot, then the next. I was still moving forward, and that was enough. It was a Tuesday when the call came, not dramatic, not disruptive. Just the soft buzz of my prepaid phone vibrating on the kitchen counter as I stirred sugar into my coffee. I almost let it go to voicemail. I didn't recognize the number, and these days, I was careful with who I let back into my peace. But something nudged me. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was just the curiosity that comes when life's been too still for a while. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and picked up. Hello? There was a pause, then a voice, nervous, young but familiar. Mr. Monroe? It's Marcus, from the Builders program. My chest tightened slightly, then eased. Marcus, the teenager with the quiet focus, the one who measured 3 times before cutting once. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. Marcus, I said. Good to hear your voice. Everything all right? Yeah, he said quickly. Yes, sir, everything's good. Another pause. I know it's been a while, but I've been working on something. A project. Actually, it's more than that. It's kind of a program. My school's letting me develop a summer workshop for kids who don't have access to tools or mentors. I remembered what you taught me. Not just about wood or nails, but about paying attention. About building things that last. I leaned against the counter, letting his words wash over me. I could hear the eagerness in his voice. That unpolished energy of someone chasing purpose instead of approval. That's good, Marcus, I said quietly. That's real good. He exhaled, relieved. I was wondering, would you help? Not full-time. Just show up. Teach one of the Saturday classes. Maybe tell your story. The other mentors are younger, but none of them built something the way you did. And the kids we're working with, a few from the foster system, a couple whose dads are in prison. I think they'd listen to you. There was a long moment where I didn't speak. Not because I was unsure, but because I felt something unfamiliar forming in my chest. A kind of invitation I hadn't expected. Not to return to the past, but to pass it forward. All right, I said at last. Tell me where and when. He laughed, almost disbelieving. Really? You'll come? I said I would, didn't I? Yeah, yes, sir. I'll text you the address. Thank you. You have no idea what this means. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, coffee cooling in the cup beside me. I wasn't a teacher. Not really. Not by trade. But somehow, somewhere along the way, I'd become one without meaning to. Maybe that's what real teaching was, just living your life out loud with enough clarity that someone else can take direction from it. Maybe we all leave trails behind us, whether we know it or not. That Saturday, I arrived early. The community center was in a rougher part of town than the one I'd volunteered at before graffiti on the side of the building, chain link fence bent in one corner, the sidewalk cracked and worn. But inside, the gym buzzed with the same promise I'd felt months earlier. Tables set up with toolkits, blueprints spread out like treasure maps, kids laughing too loudly, volunteers trying to appear more confident than they felt. And there, near the whiteboard, stood Marcus, taller now, broader in the shoulders, but still with that quiet focus. When he saw me, his face lit up in a way that reminded me why I'd come. He walked over quickly, clipboard in hand. You really came, he said, not as a question, but as a kind of stunned realization. You asked, I said simply. He led me through the space, showing me what they were working on: birdhouses, planter boxes, one ambitious group trying to build a bench for the local bus stop. I thought maybe you could float around, Marcus said. Help with measurements, check safety stuff, maybe even tell a story or two. I nodded. I can do that. He hesitated, then added, There's one boy I want you to meet, Eli. He doesn't say much, but he watches everything, just like I did. He pointed toward a lanky 12-year-old near the back wall, hunched over a miter box, sawing wood with intense precision. His hands were small but steady, movements slow and calculated. I recognized the posture instantly, the same way I used to work when Margaret first got sick, head down, focused, as if building something solid could make the world stop shifting. I walked over slowly, crouched beside him. You mind if I sit here? He glanced at me briefly, shrugged, then kept sawing. I watched him work for a while before speaking again. That cut's a little shallow. You want that joint to hold, you're going to need a deeper angle. He paused, looked at me again, then made the adjustment without saying a word. Good. He wasn't afraid to listen. For the next hour, I worked with Eli, showing him how to brace wood properly, how to eyeball 90 degrees when your square is missing, how to sand against the grain. He didn't talk, but he didn't need to. The way he leaned in, the way he asked with his hands, told me everything I needed to know. There was pain there, maybe anger, but also patience, and buried somewhere under all of it a flicker of hope. Later, Marcus gathered the kids in a semicircle and said, This is Paul Monroe. He built his own home, from scratch. Not with a team, not with a company, just him, his wife, and a lot of faith. They looked at me like I was from another world. One girl raised her hand. You really built it alone? I nodded. The framing, the wiring, the floorboards, all of it. Why? Someone asked. I looked around at their faces, so open, so new. Because I wanted a home no one could take from me. Because I wanted to prove to someone I loved that I could make something solid. Because sometimes the only way to build peace is to build it with your own hands. They were quiet, even the restless ones. Not because I was special, but because they recognized something they didn't have words for, yet a kind of quiet determination that doesn't need applause, just space. When the session ended, Eli walked over and handed me his project, a small wooden box, rough around the edges but neatly measured. It's not perfect, he muttered. I took it gently. Neither am I said, but it's sturdy, and that's what matters. He didn't smile. Not really, but his eyes softened. Will you come back next week? He asked. I looked at Marcus, then at the room behind him, still buzzing with energy. Yeah, I said. I think I will. That night, I sat by the window in my apartment, the little wooden box beside me. I ran my thumb along its edge and thought about Margaret, about Samantha, about the house I once built with my hands, and the life I was now building with my time. I wasn't anyone's burden. I wasn't anyone's bank account, or afterthought, or excuse. I was someone's mentor, someone's example, someone's steady hand. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was starting over. I felt like I'd finally arrived. It started with a conversation in the back of the community center gym, just as we were wrapping up another Saturday session. I had just helped Eli and two other kids finish the final touches on a simple standing shelf, a project they'd designed themselves. The cuts weren't perfect, and one of the legs leaned slightly, but when they stood it upright, it held, and that was all they needed. Carla walked over as I was wiping sawdust off my hands, her expression thoughtful in that way I'd come to recognize. "Paul," she said, "there's a woman from KDAN Local News who's doing a segment on the mentorship programs in Denver. I mentioned you. I hope that's okay." I looked at her, not answering right away. "She'd like to feature one of our volunteers," Carla continued. "You're the story, Paul. Not just the house you built, not just the money you gave, but the way you showed up, after everything, the way you keep showing up." I set down the rag I was holding and took a slow breath. The idea of cameras made me itch. I hadn't told my story to many people. Not really. Just one teenager at a time, over wood and nails and quiet understanding. "I'm not really a television person," I said. Carla gave me a small smile. "That's exactly why she wants you." The interview was scheduled for the following Wednesday. A morning slot. Nothing flashy. Just a 7-minute segment buried between weather updates and weekend events. I arrived early, because old habits don't change. The studio was smaller than I imagined, less glamorous, more functional. A lot of bright lights and makeup chairs, and people moving quickly with clipboards. The producer, a young man named Vince, greeted me at the door. "Mr. Monroe," he said, "thank you for coming in. We really appreciate it. We'll keep this casual. Just a conversation." I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. He led me to a small green room where a woman in her 30s waited camera-ready, polished, with a natural warmth that didn't feel rehearsed. "Hi," she said, offering her hand. "I'm Lisa Caldwell. I'll be asking you a few questions on air. We've heard some really inspiring things about you." "That makes one of us," I replied. She laughed lightly, but I didn't mean it as a joke. I meant it as truth. I hadn't set out to inspire anyone. I just wanted to be left in peace. And somehow, in doing that, I'd found something worth sharing. 10 minutes later, I was seated in a chair across from Lisa, microphone clipped to my collar, lights beaming down. A countdown began in the background, and then we were live. "Today, we're joined by Paul Monroe," Lisa began, smiling at the camera, "a retired engineer who's become something of a quiet legend in the Cherry Hills community." I winced internally. Legend was too big a word for a man who had once cried alone in the dark because his daughter saw him as disposable. But I didn't correct her. I just waited. "Paul," she said, turning to me, "can you tell us how you got involved with the Young Builders program?" I took a breath, steadying myself. "I built a house once," I began, "a long time ago, with my wife. It was just the two of us. We poured the foundation, framed the walls, installed every piece of trim with our own hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours." Lisa nodded, prompting me with silence. "Years later," I continued, "my daughter and her husband decided I didn't belong in that house anymore, that I was better off somewhere managed. They made plans behind my back, talked about what they'd get when I was gone. But I wasn't gone, and I wasn't helpless. My voice was low even, but I felt every word vibrate through my ribs. So I sold the house, took the money, left quietly. I moved into a small apartment and tried to remember who I was before I became someone else's responsibility." Lisa's smile had softened, her eyes glistening not with pity, but with that rare recognition that comes when someone hears something true. "And now you mentor teenagers who want to build things," she said gently. "Why?" I looked down for a moment, then back at her. "Because I know what it feels like to build something with your own hands. And I know what it feels like to be ignored. These kids, some of them, have no fathers, no homes, no one telling them they're capable. I don't give them money. I give them tape measures, levels, encouragement. I give them structure. And you'd be amazed what someone can become when you stop seeing them as broken and start seeing them as builders." "Oh," she asked me a few more questions about Eli, about Marcus, about the bench by the bus stop. I answered as simply as I could. I wasn't performing. I wasn't auditioning for sainthood. I was just telling the truth. And when the segment ended, when the cameras shut off, Lisa reached across and touched my arm. "Thank you," she said. That was one of the most grounded conversations I've had in months. I left the studio quietly, stepping into the late morning sun, unsure if anyone I knew had watched. I didn't tell Samantha. I didn't need to. If she saw it, she saw it. If she didn't, I hadn't done it for her. That evening, I went back to the cafe. Sarah, the barista, was wiping the counter when I walked in. "Mr. Monroe," she said, eyes lighting up. "You were on television." I laughed. Briefly, hopefully forgettably. "You kidding?" She grinned. "You had more presence than the mayor last week. 2 customers came in and asked if you still drink black coffee with a little sugar. I told them you do, and they tipped me $1 just for saying so." She poured my usual and handed it over. "Good job, Mr. M. Seriously." I took my coffee, nodded, and sat by the window. Across the street, someone had set up a small table with a "Free Tools for Teens" sign. It wasn't fancy, just a few hammers, some paintbrushes, a level. But it was something. Maybe someone had seen the segment. Maybe they'd felt a pull. Maybe, just maybe, quiet lives like mine could echo louder than I ever thought possible. That night, I returned to my apartment and sat in the armchair by the bookshelf. The letter Samantha had written to Margaret still sat untouched in the back of the journal. I didn't take it out. I didn't need to yet. It was enough knowing it was there, that she had written it, that she had shown up. People didn't change because they were scolded. They changed because someone showed them a better way. I wasn't perfect, but I was steady. And in a world full of noise, sometimes that's all you need. A steady hand, a steady voice, a steady man. I turned off the lights and looked out at the city glowing faintly, breathing, carrying the stories of millions. Somewhere out there, Eli was probably sanding a new project. Marcus was planning his next blueprint. And someone I'd never meet was maybe holding a hammer for the first time, remembering a few words from an old man on morning television. I didn't need fame. I didn't need thanks. I just needed to know that something I built outlived the weight of what I lost. And tonight, I knew. It was a postcard that brought the decision to the surface, a quiet nudge in the middle of an otherwise ordinary afternoon. It had no return address, no name, just a photo of a weathered wooden pier stretching out into a pale blue horizon. On the back, in handwriting I hadn't seen in over 30 years, were 5 words: "Still waiting if you are." It was from a man named Calvin Green, an old friend from my earliest years in construction, back when Margaret and I still talked about moving west someday. After the cancer diagnosis, the plan had been shelved, then slowly buried under medical bills, routines, grief, and eventually inertia. Calvin had retired early and bought a small cottage outside of Mendocino on a stretch of coastline so peaceful it made silence feel like music. I'd never visited, never followed up, and yet here he was, reaching out from the other side of an old promise. I left the postcard on my nightstand for 3 days, untouched but ever present. In the mornings I'd glance at it while tying my shoes. In the evenings it caught the last rays of sunset like it had been lit on purpose. By the 4th day I sat down with a legal pad and drew a line down the center. On one side I wrote California. On the other, Denver. Under California, I listed the ocean, old friends, a quiet ending. Under Denver, I listed Marcus Eli, the program, the unfinished shelf at the community center, the kids still showing up on Saturdays with secondhand tool belts and first-time hope. I looked at the list for a long while before realizing something Margaret used to say floated back into my mind. Some homes are built with wood, others are built with presence. She'd meant it as a comfort, I think, during one of those early years when we still lived in a rental and felt 1,000 miles from anything permanent. But now, the words felt like instruction. I wasn't looking for peace by the ocean. I already had peace in the measured steps I took towards something that outlived me. The next morning, I called Calvin. He picked up on the second ring. "Took you long enough," he said, voice raspy but warm. I smiled into the receiver. "I'm still waiting too," I said, "but I think I'll be waiting right here." He didn't argue, just said, "I figured. You always were better at staying put when it counted." We caught up for a few minutes. He told me about his garden, about the pelicans that nested near the dock, about how he still kept a hammer in the shed even though he hadn't built anything in 10 years. Just in case, he said. You never know when something needs fixing. After we hung up, I slipped the postcard into Margaret's journal alongside Samantha's letter and closed the cover. That afternoon, I returned to the community center. The gym was half full, buzzing with quiet effort. Carla waved from across the room, and I made my way to the back where Marcus and Eli were working on a new project, something taller, more complex. We're building shelves for the local shelter, Marcus said without looking up. They're expanding the intake wing, and they need storage. Smart, I said. Custom-built beats store-bought every time. Eli nodded, then reached for a level without being asked. He'd grown more confident lately, not just in his hands, but in the way he carried himself, like he believed he belonged in the world he was shaping. I stayed for hours, measuring, correcting angles, sanding edges. At one point, Marcus asked if I'd ever thought about opening a shop, an actual one, with walls, a name, maybe even classes during the week. We've got the people, he said, and you've got the know-how. Why not make it permanent? I started to laugh, then stopped. He wasn't joking, and the thought, unexpected as it was, didn't feel absurd. It felt possible. That night I sat at my kitchen table and drafted a plan. A rough sketch, nothing formal. But as I drew, the ideas came. A modest space in an affordable part of town, a handful of donated tools, a name, the Foundry maybe, or Second Measure. A place not just to build furniture, but to build confidence. A place for those no one expects anything from. I didn't need funding. I had the money. I didn't need applause. I'd had my say. All I needed was the will to lay the first board. By the end of the week, Carla connected me with a landlord who had a vacant workshop near a bus route. Concrete floors, good bones, nothing fancy. But I walked through it and saw light. I saw benches lining the walls. I saw shelves stacked with donated wood. I saw Marcus, clipboard in hand. Eli, sanding quietly in the corner. I saw Saturdays that would stretch long and full. I signed the lease that afternoon. That evening, I poured myself a glass of Margaret's favorite wine and stood in the doorway of my apartment. The sun was setting, casting gold against the window panes. On the bookshelf, her journal stood like a quiet witness. I didn't say anything out loud. I didn't need to. She would have seen it in my hands, in my posture, in the dust on my sleeves. This wasn't a reinvention. It was the natural conclusion of a life that refused to end in silence. I wasn't moving to the coast. I wasn't chasing a view. I was planting something right where I stood. And for the first time, the idea of staying felt like movement. Thank you for staying with us through this story. If something in it resonated with you, a quiet moment, a hard choice, a lesson learned too late, but just in time, then this channel was made for you. We tell stories not just to entertain, but to remember, to reflect, to remind each other that sometimes the most powerful changes begin in silence, in stillness, and in the simple act of standing up for yourself. If you found value here, consider subscribing. One click helps us reach more people who need to hear stories like this. Stories that don't rely on noise or spectacle, but on heart, on truth, and on the courage it takes to start again, no matter your age. And while you're here, we'd love to hear from you. Scroll down to the comments and let us know where you're listening from, or tell us what part of the story stayed with you the longest. Your reflections matter. They help us shape what comes next. So, if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell, and join us for the next chapter. Because in this space, every story counts. And yours just might be the next one we tell. Until then, stay kind, stay grounded, and never underestimate the quiet ones.